Okay then, hi guys. Welcome back. We have a little less than 10 minutes till the class lecture starts. But anyway, good to see you, and hope you're all doing great. Just get things rolling at that time. But welcome back, Anthony, Santino, Jemin, and all the others. About 8 minutes. Hey, Elena. Welcome back. Okay, 6 minutes, everybody. Jemin. That is okay. No worries. Thanks for letting me know. I totally understand it. It's okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. The kitties are running around down there, so that's why I kind of keep looking down. 5 minutes. Good afternoon. Hi, Jasmine. About 4 minutes. Just giving you updates on the countdown. 'Hey, Jennifer, Michelle. Good to see you guys back here. 3 minutes. Okay. Up here? No? Hey, Mary Jane. Okay. Couple minutes, 2 minutes, then I'll get started. Hey. Okay. Okay, just another 1 minute, so we're pretty much almost ready to start. Just waiting till the turn of the hour. Hey, Rosemary, and all the others. So we're pretty much now at 4 p.m. Therefore, I'm just going to get us, underway, get us into our notes and everything. Welcome back, guys, and as usual, it's great to see you today. I'll be, as I've mentioned, I think in the last recording, I'm going to be sending everybody back their scores and comments for the midterm exam this weekend, sometime on Sunday before the end of the day. So you'll receive a personal email from me, just as you did with the first essay, to reveal your score and comments. So just hang in there. I'm almost done. I just need another couple days, and the weekend will provide me with ample time, so not to worry about that. Aside from that, we have a couple more lectures on this new unit that we opened up last time, the moral issue of war, terrorism, and torture. So we were kind of midway through our opening notes on that on Tuesday. I'll kind of remind you of some of the big points that we already covered, and then we'll resume and finish the rest of the article by Douglas Lackey that we didn't quite get to fully discuss. So, okay, here's where we're at in the lecture. So as you know, we've covered different topics in the class, moving from ethical theory to abortion to drug use and policy, to genetic engineering, human cloning, and then now we're taking a strong look at the war, terrorism, and torture issue. So as we began, we just kind of mentioned that obviously war is something that could be considered morally problematic because of the obvious fact that it involves killing and destruction of life and property. Nobody in, I think, a perfect world would ever hope for there to be such a thing as war. But of course, we've seen wars happen throughout history and all the way through to the current day. So questions have to be asked as to if it's morally possible to justify war, then under what conditions or whether that's the case. I'm just looking at the total number of people that we have, and it's not exactly a satisfying total. So I'm going to go ahead and try to post something on Canvas. But I just want to repeat to anybody who's watching this, whether you're watching it now, whether you're watching it on a recording later, you've got to come to class. This is not just an online class. This is a synchronous class. You're supposed to be here in the live stream, taking notes, listening to what I'm saying, and all the rest. Hey Tyler, Daniel, Natalia, Leanne. Well, it looks like we're starting to get a few more to trickle in. So maybe I'll just be patient, and if I don't see a solid number, maybe at around 410, then I'll go ahead and make a post, just to try and get as maximum people as possible. But you know what? Since I already started on this opening of a different window, I'm just going to do it. It only takes 1 second. But it's a little annoying because I don't want to have to always do it. Whatever, though. Okay, give me 2 minutes, or 1 minute, less than a minute. Okay, sorry for the little wait. Give me 2 moments. Okay, I just published that. I know that when you have the Canvas app, you get a notification right away. So hopefully some people start coming in. All right, back to my little breakdown and summary. Violet, Nick, Leanne, and all the others that are here. I really appreciate you guys being here and being timely and punctual. Okay, so different positions on the moral justification of war that we talked about. Does anybody remember the name of any of them? There were three big positions, and I'll just kind of do a quick, brief summary just to make sure we haven't lost sight of that. Some people, when it comes to war, they hold these different perspectives on whether it could be morally justified. Someone may know the name of at least one of the three. So if you do, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and let's go ahead and see what you think. Perspectives, positions on the moral justifiability of war. Good, Mary Jane. One of them is realism. And so realism is the idea that there's no morality that applies to war, that morality doesn't apply to war, but instead of moral questions like, is this action or is the entire war itself justified morally or not? They ask questions, and they say the only real questions are things like, does this action or war advance the aims of the warring nation or the state that is engaging in the action? They think that war is some kind of inevitable outgrowth of human social organization. And so to that perspective, let's not debate or discuss whether it's right or wrong to fight wars or to take any particular military actions within war. But of course, against the realist, you could say that some fundamental standards should still apply in war, and that morality can still be a part of war, that there could be immoral or unethical conduct within war, like war crimes, or that certain wars could be morally unjustified. On the opposite extreme of realism, someone may remember another one. Another term, anybody? Just going back into it. Got to stay active and engaged. I don't want you to be too passive. I know I'm giving you clear notes, but I do want there to be a little bit of back and forth. So besides the realist standpoint, we discussed 2 others. Maybe someone knows the opposite of realism. Eddie's crying over there. But yeah, let me know if you got the fact. Don't sit on the sidelines and wait for someone else to do it. See, Mary Jane, you're being very good. I like that. But everybody, there's a psychological phenomenon that's called the diffusion of responsibility. That means that when you're in a group, sometimes you think someone else will do this, so I don't have to do it. But that is such a pervasive psychological trait that it paralyzes whole groups into inaction. So, like if you're in a classroom and somebody says, "Who knows the answer to this question?" You're often the student in that class who knows there's like 30 other people, and you're like, "Well, I'm not going to raise my hand because it's kind of awkward to have to say something, and maybe someone else will do it." But it's like everyone in the class knows the answer, and they're just waiting for someone else to do something. I don't want that to be your habit, not just in my class, but in your whole life. You need to maintain your independence, and you need to maintain your agency. So that means that when you're doing something, you got to be present, and you can't just be sitting by waiting for someone else to do it. But anyway, correct, Mary Jane. The other opposite of realism perspective is called anti-war pacifism. In anti-war pacifism, the perspective is that war is always wrong, and that war cannot be morally justified, either because it's a violation of the duty to protect the right to life, or maybe because the person judges that in utilitarian terms, there's never been a war that has achieved enough benefit to outweigh the harms. But against the anti-war pacifist, and we'll talk about arguments against it as we continue through the notes, some people think that obviously it's possible for you to believe that the value of life is so sacred that you might need to use lethal force occasionally to defend it against the greater share of its destruction. And then there was just war theory. That's the third of the three possible positions that we're talking about on Tuesday. So according to the whole just war theory perspective, it's not that all wars are wrong or that every war is acceptable, but instead they say it just depends. Some wars may be morally justified on that view, but only if they can satisfy certain specific criteria or conditions. There are two different conditions, or I should say, there are two different sets of principles in just war theory. There's the just ad bellum conditions, which are supposed to state what the requirements are for it to be morally permissible to launch or initiate a war. And there's 6 of those that we all talked about last time. And I'll just quickly summarize them one more time. So according to just war theory, one of the conditions, or let me ask anybody here, what is one of the conditions of just war theory that you may remember? See if you can tell me which ones you may remember. Because there were 6 in total. So it's a recent lecture. It's not exactly ancient history. I think it's reasonable enough that you might be able to give me that piece of info. Just cause, correct. That's one of the most central and fundamental ones. Got to catch them all, though. Does anyone know another one? Okay, just cause. I see the same, Jennifer. Fair enough. Anyone else? Legitimate authority, also correct. So there's a second out of 6. Just cause, legit authority. Any other greatest hits while we're on the topic? Let me know, chat. Is there another one? I'll summarize all of them. I just want to give you a chance to give me some more. Last resort, very good. There's another. That's 3 out of 6. And, you know, if you're collecting your thoughts, I'll just sort of start listing a few of the other ones. We also have right intention, reasonable probability of success, and the proportionality condition. So I'll just go through them in the order I did last time, 1 through 6. The first that I mentioned, legitimate authority. That just requires that in order for it to be a just war, a morally acceptable war, it has to be launched by a proper authority. And that's typically considered to be a head of state, or at least a person or persons that are officially responsible or recognized as being responsible for the interests of a political community, for the care and protection of a political community. So when you're a head of state that's appointed to office through like a democratic process, say a president, prime minister, sometimes congressional bodies could be in that role. Sometimes monarch leaders could also somehow be in that role. So the head of state basically, but also it could include encompassing also perhaps the head or leadership of revolutionary war movements or civil war factions, if their base of support is wide and recognized widely. Because we can't discount the at least theoretical justifiability of revolutionary wars or civil wars. Now, there's also just cause. Just cause is one of the most key. That is supposed to be the requirement that in order for the war to be permissible to fight, it has to be done for a morally acceptable reason. The most basic and central of the morally acceptable reasons that people talk about is self-defense, defensive necessity. So it's supposed to be the case that when you're going to war, you couldn't have prevented it and you've exhausted all the other alternatives to war. Like, for example, diplomatic engagement and sanctions and other kinds of pressure. But if all those fail, then you might think that you've reached the point of having to go to war for defensive necessity, but it's not supposed to be acceptable to do it for like empire, revenge, genocide, or things like that. Right intention goes hand in hand with just cause. Right intention means that you're only supposed to have the intent while you're fighting for this just cause to get back to a peacetime status quo, but that you don't use the just cause as a pretext to wage the war for more immoral reasons. Also, last resort, I think I kind of touched on that in passing, not sure why I did, but anyway, last resort, you got to try everything else, it's got to fail. You got to try all kind of non-military alternatives, and then if you reach the last resort, you can say that it's acceptable. You're also supposed to adhere to the proportionality requirement, which means that the total costs of the war are supposed to be outweighed by whatever benefits the war will deliver. Otherwise, it would be a war that caused more harm than good. And then finally, there has to be at least some reasonable chance that the nation could win, a reasonable chance of success. Otherwise, you're fighting a futile war. Then we started to open up discussion on the jus in bello conditions. And I believe the last thing I talked to you about was the principle of discrimination. Isn't that right? Is that fair? Can anyone confirm that that was where we sort of ran out of time on our Tuesday meeting? Principle of discrimination, guys? Yeah, under the jus in bello? Okay, good. So I have one more of those jus in bello conditions because they're just two. Second jus in bello condition. Okay, so the second jus in bello condition is also called the proportionality requirement, but it's the military proportionality requirement instead of the jus ad bellum one, which sometimes is called the political proportionality requirement. So let me tell you about proportionality part 2 as it applies to the jus in bello principles. So what this just means is that all the military actions taken in war should not exceed the level of violence that is minimally necessary to achieve the mission. So okay, so what it says there is proportionality. All military actions taken within the war should not exceed the level of violence that's needed in order to achieve the mission. There's a typo there. It should say or objective, so I'm just going to like make sure that that's clear with a little star below. So what that means is that it's supposed to prevent overkill and doing more destructive things than are necessary within the war. Suppose that you knew that there was like an enemy target, like I don't know, a leader of the enemy army that was housed in a certain village or city. You just have intelligence on your side that tells you that this person's present in the whole city, but you don't have more specific information as to like the precise location. Suppose that your decision as a military leader or officer was to just drop a nuclear weapon on the whole city and just nuke the whole city to get one person. You might argue, and of course you should agree, I think, that that would be disproportionate, that that would be more violence than is needed to achieve that simple, well, I don't know if simple, but that limited objective. So if you could manage to get the same result of killing or neutralizing this one enemy combatant, but doing so with like targeted strikes or with a small team of specialists that can go into the field, then that would be preferable because it would spare from death and destruction the entire town. So if you're trying to get to one person, it seems like it's a little bit unnecessary and overkill to like annihilate an entire town or village. The proportionality requirement means that we should always be thinking not just when the war is launched, how much total destruction will the whole war cost as opposed to the benefit it might deliver. That's the political proportionality requirement that's part of jus ad bellum. But once the war is now going on, you have to make individual decisions as you're fighting it about each action or military action that's taken internal to the war. So this second proportionality requirement is again supposed to sort of like limit the level of destructiveness and violence to the minimum level needed to achieve the objective, but not more than that. You know, you're not supposed to like carpet bomb whole cities just to take out one bridge or one, target. So those two just in bello conditions are supposed to guide and direct the acceptable moral conduct internal to war. Just ad bellum talks about what's needed for the starting of war to be acceptable. Just in bello talks about what would be needed for the internal conduct inside the war to be acceptable too. And so we have those two principles. Discrimination principle means you're supposed to discriminate or make distinctions between non-combatants and combatants and never deliberately target those non-combatants. Take all active efforts to never deliberately target those innocent non-combatants. That's the discrimination principle, so that you just don't go in there and indiscriminately kill like everybody and everything that's moving, sparing women and children, injured people in hospitals, and prisoners of war. And then the second just in bello condition is the one just mentioned, proportionality, but it's the proportionality requirement as related to individual military actions instead of the overall scope of the war itself. Okay. Now, this is a unit in the class that's about war, terrorism, and torture. So I'm going to say a few things, as they say in the editor's introduction to the chapter on terrorism. We probably feel like we have a basic intuitive understanding of the concept of terrorism when we see it by example, whether it's like a 9/11 attack or Oklahoma City bombing or, I don't know, Boston Marathon finish line bombing, and others, of course, that we could mention. But instead of just pointing out examples of terrorism and saying terrorism is just that, we'd like to have some kind of general definition, like what general features do all these various examples share? I'm not sure what your opinion might be, but the textbook says that the right definition has to be the correct level of specificity, because if it was too broad and you just said violent actions, then it would include things that are not really terrorism, like bank robberies or domestic violence or something. On the other hand, he thinks, or they think, the editor, that it shouldn't be such a narrowly tailored definition so that it excludes or that it's restricted rather to only non-state actors, because there could perhaps be state-sponsored terrorism. So the textbook, anyway, Lewis Vaughn, the editor, he offers us this definition of terrorism to use as a sort of operational definition. Terrorism. So the deliberate use or threat of physical violence against non-combatants. So let me get it all out there. So there you see it stated there in the chat. The deliberate use or threat of physical violence against non-combatants to advance political, religious, or ideological aims. So think about the definition. We're talking about violence or threats of violence against people that are not actually fighting soldiers, non-combatants, innocent people. And why do that? If it's truly terrorism, it's done for some kind of motivation like the ones specified there. It could be to advance a political agenda or goal. It could be to advance a sort of extremist religious idea, or maybe just an ideological idea. Suppose that you have people bombing, I don't know, patients at an abortion clinic. They may have ideological beliefs about the wrongness of abortion, and that's their motive. Or if you had an extremist within a certain religion that attacks a member of an opposed religion, they may think that this is necessary because the members of these other religions are like evil people that are outside of line with God's will, and that could be a religious motive. It could be also a political motive. Suppose that there's people who judge that there's a foreign army or military that's done things that they don't believe in, or perhaps that there's a government promoting policies that they think are morally deficient, so they attack, I don't know, government offices or people in cafes, and they do it in order to try and draw attention to their righteous, or believed at least to be righteous, cause. So if we think about terrorism along the lines of this definition, then it's definitely something that's got a long history. It's not a new phenomenon in history. It's been around for a while. We've seen religious wars involving this, of conquest, some actions that were taken in revolutionary wars or revolutionary movements like the French Revolution, and also nationalist terrorism. In the 20th century, perhaps we could classify state-sponsored terrorism as like what the Nazis did, trying to exterminate Jewish people, and more. Now, It's definitely a question that we probably don't usually ask, but in this class, there's some literature in the book about it. So we'll touch on it briefly next week, I think, on Thursday. Some might ask, is terrorism something that could ever be morally permitted, at least theoretically? And there are some authors, including Andrew Valls, who will say that it's possible to create a moral justification for it. Some people argue that on consequentialist or utilitarian grounds, you could frame an argument that justifies this. You could argue that in case terrorist actions were taken, that the good to be achieved through the terrorist action outweighs the harms that the act causes. So suppose that through an act of terrorism, you expelled a foreign army from occupying your land. You might say, well, it was, of course, regrettable that any innocent people came to harm, but if this is the outcome is so abundantly valuable that it overcompensates for the harm and loss of the innocent people. So that type of view would say that the innocence of the victims is just one factor to be weighed in the balance to consider how much benefit that could actually generate, or that perhaps it's not as important as the good being promoted by the act. And some people could argue, and I think Valls does this, some people might say that terrorism could be justified in the same way as just war theory, that it could somehow pass through the principles of just war theory and be justified according to that analysis. Of course, it's a little bit of a strained case to make. It's a difficult argument to make because there's some fundamental principles of just war theory that you would probably think terrorism does generally violate. I don't know if you have any views on that. Anyone here in the chat? Going back to our principles of just war theory, can you think of any of them that it would seem that terrorism violates, or that it's probably a reasonable case that it does violate it, even if it might not be immediately obvious? Let's see anybody here. If you can think of any of those principles, the 6 just ad bellum principles, the 2 just in bello principles, there are some that really pop out almost by definition as being violated through terrorist actions. But I wonder if you have any views, or if you can make those connections too. Let me know. And I feel a little bit badly for the whatever it is, dozen or not less than a dozen people that are here. You guys are having to do a heavy lift because if I'm asking questions, you really don't have a lot of people to defer to. I'm going to make a point about this, though. I'm going to send something out on Canvas because I'm not very happy with the low attendance numbers. Basic point is, like, I'm going to have to attach better penalties to people that aren't coming to class. So, you know, we'll start having to do that. It's unfortunate that I have to do that, but let it be known, you got to come to this class. You got to be here. You're not just supposed to watch these lectures later, or not at all, even worse. So we'll find a way to punish people that aren't trying to show up for the class. But anyway, right intention, you suggest, Mary Jane. Possibly so, right? Because right intention means that your only motive has to be to achieve peace. But suppose that you were, like, I don't know, a religious extremist, and you believe that you had to eliminate all members of opposite religions or different religions. In that case, you might say, well, it's not really that we're just trying to get to peace. We're trying to advance, like, and erect, like, some kind of religious or theocratic state. So in that case, this is not a just cause in the first place. So it also, I think, violates the just cause requirement because it's not just mere defensive necessity, perhaps. And also, even if you were able to, like, repel threats to your autonomy or something, or to the autonomy of a political community, if your goals were more far-reaching than that, then it probably wouldn't be a right intention either. Proportionality, you say, Jennifer? Do you mean proportionality in the political or the military sense? Because we do have 2 options for that now. There's the just ad bellum one, and then there's the just in bello one. I don't know. It could be both, though. You could say that it's not going to ever achieve any value because it's not going to be able to, like, get to the desired conclusion of the terrorist, I guess, faction. So all that we're going to have is, like, a lot of innocent people dying for no significant benefit, or for no change to the overall political or status quo. And you could probably also say that internal to the war, maybe there are going to be actions that are taken that don't necessarily have the minimal level of violence necessary to get to a military objective. I would think that the one that the most flagrantly is violated, though, is probably the discrimination principle of jus in bello, because what that says is that you're never supposed to deliberately attack non-combatants, and almost by definition, that's something that terrorism would, of course, involve. So anyway, it does seem like it would be a hard case to make, but we're going to read one author, Andrew Valls, next week. What he's going to say, and we'll get to him eventually, of course, but he says that if you accept the just war theory, and you think that the just war theory can provide moral justification for at least certain wars that are entered into by, like, conventional nation states, then the same criteria, he argues, at least in some principled or theorized way, could also be satisfied by terrorist conduct. So in his view, it's like if you accept the moral justifiability of wars in general, you really can't easily exclude the terrorist violence from at least theoretical moral justification as well. There's also some discussion of torture in this chapter and part of the book. Like terrorism, torture is easier to identify when you see it than to give a general definition for it. The book on page 400 gives a sort of list of a lot of nasty examples of things that could be considered torture. For example, here, searing with hot irons, burning at the stake, electric shock treatment to the genitals, cutting out parts of the body or the tongue, or entrails, severe beatings, suspending by the legs with arms tied behind the back, applying thumb screws, inserting a needle under the fingernails, drilling through an unanesthetized tooth, making a person crouch for hours in a certain painful position, waterboarding, denying food, water, or sleep for days or weeks on end. So just a little sample list. What do these different acts have in common? The book offers this little simple enough definition of torture. So what they put forward is this: intentionally inflicting severe pain or suffering on a person for purposes of coercion, punishment, intimidation, or extraction of information. Torture. It's showing there in the chat. That's basically the idea. It's inflicting severe pain or suffering on a person, and in the context of this discussion, it has to do with certain purposes. Maybe it's to coerce an individual, maybe it's to punish the individual, maybe it's simply to intimidate and create fear and terror, or it could be used to try and solicit information from the person that you think that they're withholding, that they would not be willing to reveal unless they were being hit with torture methods. So torture has unfortunately been with humanity for a long time. It's been used by governments in the past as a tool. In medieval times, it was legal to use it in Europe to acquire evidence, which they called back then judicial torture. Now, of course, that was abolished eventually in the 18th century. And today, torture is at least officially condemned throughout the world, but sadly, it is still used sometimes in certain regimes, including some of those that officially reject it. In international law, the United States has several legally binding prohibitions on torture, plus we have our own domestic laws against the same. We have, for example, the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which is some of the important language in it is included in our book on page 402. And I find it to be very interesting and sort of striking, the language that is used there to express the rules that we agreed to under this treaty. This was ratified in 1987 under President Ronald Reagan. And what it says is, no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal instability, or any other public emergency, none of these may be invoked as a justification of torture. So they try to make it very explicit and clear that, like, according to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which again, we've codified into our own law because we're a treaty member, it bars us from permissibly torturing under any circumstances, whether it's war, threat of war, public emergency, internal instability, none may be invoked as a justification of torture. For these United Nations conventions to be agreed to in the United States, there has to be like overwhelming consensus. It has to be like 2/3 of both houses of Congress plus the president all affirming that that's something that we will commit to. There's also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, just to name a few. So the United States is a signatory to all of these, which means it's illegal to torture for any reason under US policy or law. But obviously, there have been some cases in the past, like, for example, under the Bush administration, people were waterboarded in Guantanamo Bay, and the treatment of some of our detainees at military prisons in different parts of the world were right on the edge of being considered torture too. I personally find the ethical debate over torture a little bit frustrating because my own conviction is that it's absolutely and obviously wrong, maybe even worse than murder because you're lingering over the pain and suffering that you're causing the person. I mean, it's not even permissible to torture animals, you know? So for me, doing it to people is just an obvious moral, clear-cut case. But we got to talk about the philosophical debates. And some people say it's at least theoretically permitted, like a necessary evil, because people will provide us with these kind of interesting and perhaps far-fetched hypothetical scenarios. The type of hypothetical scenario that's used to provide ethical justification for torture is this like ticking time bomb type scenario. Okay, so what's the ticking time bomb scenario? The name kind of is a big hint, but basically it's this. So imagine that there's a terrorist who has a timed explosive that they put in a public place where there's a lot of people. And if it reaches 0 on the timer, it'll detonate and blow up. And of course, it will kill a bunch of innocent people in this densely populated area. Suppose that we believe and know somehow that the terrorist is fully aware of where the location of the device is, but he's not willing or they're not willing to reveal the location. Suppose that the urgency of finding this weapon and clearing people away from where it might explode or sending in like bomb squad technicians to defuse the bomb, it's such a pressing matter that suppose you think, well, if no other method of getting them to disclose the whereabouts are working, some people believe that in that case, torture could be morally acceptable as a last resort method by which we could get the information out of the person. It might be more responsive to coercive methods of interrogation that involve torture than other methods. In a way, these type of ticking time bomb scenarios put utilitarian intuitions to the test. They ask you to wonder and to contemplate whether it would ever be morally acceptable to do something as prima facie wrong as torture to another human being, if, for example, it was the only available means to extract vital information that might save a greater number of lives. In a utilitarian way, I mean, I guess you could think about theoretically, yeah, if we're going to save 100 lives by torturing a person for 5 minutes, then maybe that's something that on the balance of overall happiness is better than not doing so. But in my own mind, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this, the scenario itself is hard to really think about being realistic, because the scenario presupposes that we already know what the person that's being tortured is probably going to deny, that they have clear knowledge of the whereabouts of that thing. So we can't necessarily assume like we're an omniscient God that we can see into the mind of the person, that they're withholding info that otherwise they would reveal through torture. The other thing is, a lot of, I think, studies have indicated that torture is an unreliable method of gaining info, because once people are being tortured, they pretty much react with such desperation and panic and fear that they'll say anything, including whatever they think that the person administering torture wants them to say. So they could give false confessions, they could produce false leads that might actually consume more time, money, and energy than if we had used more time-tested and traditional methods of interrogation tactics. But anyway, with all that behind us, let's proceed to discuss the first of the essays on the topic, which deals with the moral justifiability of war. We're going to start by talking about pacifism. And so who are pacifists? Pacifists can be thought of as people who are very serious about the moral requirement not to kill, and who think that the right to life is absolute and inviolable, and that they don't even think that we should take the killing of not just civilians, but even soldiers for granted. If we all have a right to life, then a person might argue that intentionally killing people is a deliberate violation of the right to life, and it's always immoral, whether the person being killed is a soldier or an innocent civilian or anybody else. Sadly, many people that are pro-life in their position on the abortion debate are not necessarily anti-war. Some people believe and argue that that could be a little bit of a moral inconsistency. You believe so passionately in the value of the life of the fetus and that they have a right to life and not to have their lives ended because of how much their future matters or something like that. But wouldn't that same intuition transfer over somewhat to your feelings about whether war could be ethically justified, because it's very destructive of life just as well? But of course, we'll see both sides of the argument. There are going to be critics of pacifism that say that if the right to life is so important, then isn't it inconsistent to say it would be wrong to defend the right with force if it was threatened and that was the only available means to address the threat? So here's our first author on this topic. His name is Douglas Lackey. And the paper is just called Pacifism, and it came out in 1989. Okay. Yeah, what I think I'm going to do with the whole attendance thing is I'm going to just make a post on Canvas, and it's going to say something like, look, if you're not coming to class, your absence is not excused unless you send me an email. And I'm going to take down the names of everybody who's actually here. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to take some pics right now of the screen. And if I'm not seeing the person's name on this screen and they didn't send me no email giving me some kind of excused basis for why they're not here, then I'm going to start docking their credit on their test scores. That's okay. Well, if you think that I'm not going to get your name in there, just put your name in it. I know Tyler's here. Tyler, Uncle Borat. I know you. Uh, no one special. Not exactly sure what name that corresponds with, but you'll figure it out. I'm just saying I need to be a little bit more aggressive with it because people are taking advantage of my generosity on the point that I'm not being like too mean about you not attending class, but you're here, and if you're here, this doesn't apply to you. But to the people that are not here right now, we're gonna have to deal with that. But it's okay. So I've taken some photos, and hopefully you guys continue to attend. All right. So anyway, Douglas Lackey, pacifism. This man is an advocate for pacifism. He believes in it. He believes that it's the right moral perspective. And when we finish him, we'll be back on Tuesday talking about a whole opposite point of view from Jan Narveson, or Jan Narveson. I think he's like a Scandinavian man, so I think it's Jan, Jan. But anyway, he believes that pacifism is wrong and can't be justified. So first thing that Lackey does is he talks about how there's actually different types of pacifism, and he wants to try and distinguish these different versions of it to see if they all qualify as moral theories. Now, he says that some of us are familiar with an idea of pacifism that he calls live and let live pacifism. So let me go ahead and put that here. So what live and let live pacifism says is that the person's view is, well, violence is wrong, and I would never do it personally, but if other people want to do it, then I'm not going to judge them for that. So that's the type of idea, like live and let live. Oh, I'm not going to do it. I don't believe in it personally, but if other people do it, I'm going to let them live. I'm going to let them do their thing. So here's the idea. Okay, so it says right there, live and let live pacifism. The perspective has a basic definition of a person whose thought is, while I am personally opposed to violence and killing, I don't seek to impose this viewpoint on anyone else. Lackey says that this is not actually a true moral position, that live and let live pacifism is not a bona fide, genuine moral position. It sounds more like a preference or a personal lifestyle choice. But when you think that something's wrong, if you judge that some action A or type of action A is wrong, that judgment should apply to all people who would do it. So to say that something is wrong means that you don't just think it's wrong for you to do it, but you think that it's wrong overall. So let me put the point here in the chat as well. Okay, so here's just a comment. Lackey says that so-called live and let live pacifism is not actually a true moral position, because if someone actually thinks that some conduct is morally wrong, then they should or would think that it's wrong for anyone to do it, not just them. So it shows confusion and misunderstanding about the concept of morality if you think that it's not wrong if other people do it, but I don't want to do it. You can't have a moral judgment of a type of act without believing that the judgment applies to all people who would commit the act. So to say that A is morally wrong, but it doesn't matter if other people do it, I'm not going to condemn their behavior, is to contradict yourself and demonstrate basic fundamental confusion about the concept of right and wrong itself. Moral wrongness is supposed to be something that you apply as an objective standard across all the different cases. So, okay, if you think that rape is wrong, then that means you think it's wrong for who to commit rape? Anybody? Let me see if you can follow my logic here and my explanation. Anyone, right? It doesn't make sense for someone to be like, look, rape, gross. I would never do that. But I'm not gonna I'm going to live and let live. If you want to do it, I'm just going to back off and say, do your thing. That's obviously, if that person thought that way, then they wouldn't actually have a moral opposition to rape. They would just be like saying, I don't personally prefer it, but I'm not holding other people morally at fault if they want to do the same. Now, if I like vanilla ice cream and I just say that's the best flavor, but you know what? If you like a different flavor, fair enough, so be it. Live and let live. That's not about morality, though. That's just about taste and preferences. It's about like a lifestyle choice instead of something that I think is wrong. So, if I'm a person who says, it's wrong for you to do something, if it's wrong for me to do something and it's actually morally wrong, then I should condemn the action in general terms, not just when I'm the one that's perpetrating the action. So Lackey starts off by saying some people advance this live and let live pacifist idea. They're like, I'm opposed to violence in the sense that I'm not a violent person personally, and I would never kill anybody or use violence against others. But if other people want to do that, that's them. They're a different person, and I'm not going to judge them. He says this is not a bona fide moral position. So for pacifism to truly be a moral position, it has to be prescribed for all. Moral codes are not exactly the same thing as personal lifestyle choices or preference. And if you think something's wrong for you to do, it would have to be implied that it's wrong for all to do it. So what are some actual cases or types of pacifism? Now he gets into what he thinks are some like legitimate variations on the topic of pacifism. He states 4 different versions of pacifism, or 4 different types. So here we go, 4 types of pacifism. Okay, so first of all, the first one he doesn't give necessarily like a clear label to as he does with the other 3, so I'm just going to kind of attach a label to it, and we'll call it anti-killing pacifism. Anti-killing pacifism. So this just says specifically it is wrong to kill. So this first fundamental type of pacifism hones in on the issue of killing specifically, and it says that's what's wrong. Killing is wrong. We shouldn't kill. It's wrong if it happens. It's something immoral. But it's not the only type of pacifism that could be mentioned. So here's another type, number 2. Is what he calls universal pacifism, which even goes farther than the first anti-killing type. Universal pacifism says it's wrong to use violence in general. So the reason universal pacifism is a slight different category than just the anti-killing type is because anti-killing pacifism is only focused on killing, but it's not speaking necessarily about all forms of violence in general. Universal pacifism is going even farther, saying any type of violence is wrong, even those cases of violence that don't reach the level of killing. So, suppose that there's political activism that involves not the killing of people, but like the abduction of an enemy leader from a different faction and like some type of force used against them or pain imposed on them. If you're a universal pacifist, it's not only that you wouldn't kill people, but you wouldn't even punch them. You wouldn't even hit them. You wouldn't engage in fights with them that didn't actually reach a level of fatal violence. So that's kind of like an idea that you'd see expressed by certain historical figures like Gandhi or MLK. You may know that MLK told people, like, look, even if the police are beating you or turning fire hoses on you, you've got to sort of peacefully resist without raising your hands in violence against them too. This will make a more effective show of how principled your commitment is to nonviolence. So some people say it's not just the killing's wrong, but it's any form of violence altogether that's wrong. Next, we have the interesting third case of private pacifism. Private pacifism. So what this says is that personal violence is always wrong, but that political violence could be justified. Okay, so about private pacifism. This perspective is just saying that engaging in violence as a private citizen, as an individual person, is wrong. But if you are empowered by some kind of political authority to commit violence, then that can be justified. So this would say, like, it's not okay to like kill or assault people as just an everyday person. But if you are wearing a badge or a military uniform, if you're a soldier, police officer, someone who's given some official status and being authorized by the state to wage violence, then that could be acceptable. So the private pacifism is trying to sort of split the difference, like granting permissibility to some forms of violence, those that are authorized under the state, but denying that it's acceptable for a private citizen to do the same. So some may say, okay, that's the version of pacifism I agree with. I don't necessarily want there to be no use of force or violence in the military or police forces, but private citizens shouldn't do that. Then that would just be crime. There's a saying you may never have heard, but it says that the state has a monopoly on the justified use of force. And so that's kind of in line with private pacifism. They would say that if you're an agent of the state operating according to authorized rules, then you have legitimate basis to use force. But private citizens doing that are just committing crimes. Okay, and then one more type of pacifism, which is kind of the flip side of the private pacifism, is the anti-war pacifist, which we've kind of talked about, but now we're going to get a more focused definition according to Lackey's way of putting it. Anti-war pacifism just says that personal violence could be morally justified, but political violence is always wrong. So political violence is always wrong. Sorry, that one didn't come through. Let me just do a test. To those in the chat, everything good? You can hear and see what I'm saying and writing right now? Let me know if the chat's working for you. Okay, cool. I can see that you're here in the chat. I'm going to have to, up to number 3, yeah. I couldn't get beyond number 3. Number 4, for whatever reason, I'm seeing some errors on my side. So I'm going to just write that on the board. So the fourth one is anti-war pacifism. So this just says that political violence is always wrong. But personal violence can be justified. You see it right there. Anti-war pacifism. Political violence, always wrong. Personal violence can be justified. So the anti-war pacifist is like saying that they don't believe in war. They don't believe in war. They think war is always wrong. We kind of touched on that previously. But this type of person might still think that if it's personal violence, like I'm acting in self-defense for myself, for my family, that could be justified in a specific case. But we should never sign up for fighting in war. We should never join the military because political violence is wrong in general. Now, this author, Lackey, wants to defend pacifism. He wants to try and show that pacifism is something that we should take seriously and maybe agree with. So he gives us different reasons in favor of pacifism. Let's see here. Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to write some more notes here, but I don't actually have a lot of written notes at this point, so it's going to be a lot of just talking through some things. So you see the definition listed here for number 4, anti-war pacifism. What we're going into next is a series of bullet points where he talks about reasons to take pacifism seriously. So reasons, over here I'm writing, in favor of pacifism. So we've listed the 4 different types. Now we're moving into a discussion of what could be reasons that a person might find pacifism to be like a defensible or reasonable perspective, like the author does. So the first one he gives, reason A, the biblical prohibition. The biblical prohibition, okay? So some people's belief in pacifism comes from a religious point of view. One straightforward argument for pacifism derives from the biblical commandment, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, thou shalt not kill. If you go back to the Old Testament, which is considered a central religious text for Christians, Jews, and even Muslims, it does say that God commanded people not to kill. Thou shalt not kill. And so it's stated bluntly. It's stated without qualifications. It's not like it says, thou shalt not kill usually, or thou shalt not kill most of the time. But it just says it in stark, unqualified terms. And somebody might take that seriously as a requirement given down by God. And then they may say, okay, well, that's why I'm a pacifist, because it was commanded by God that we shouldn't kill. At least that would be supportive of some of the different varieties of pacifism that were mentioned above. But obviously, there are some criticisms of that. So I want to tell you not just about the point that he gives, but the counterpoint. Some might say that if you actually interpret the Bible, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. And if you go back to the Hebrew dialect, the phrase is, some people interpret it as thou shalt not murder or do no murder, which is a slightly different meaning than the more unqualified statement thou shalt not kill. If it's just thou shalt not murder, then you might think that the prohibition is not against all killing, but only wrongful killing, which is what murder basically is. Another point that could be raised in counter to this biblical prohibition basis is to say that, well, if you really read through the Bible, it's filled with all kinds of divinely requested acts of killing, making it unclear that God is always opposed to killing in every case. So like if you read through the Bible and it says thou shalt not kill, you might be like, okay, fair enough, but what about this other part of the Bible where God says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, or he that blasphemeth the name of God shall be put to death, and the whole congregation shall stone him. Those are a couple of the ones I'm mentioning here, but I'll go to the textbook to read off from page 407 some other examples of biblical writings or scriptures where it says that actually you're supposed to kill. So as the book says, this argument is subject to criticism. The original language of Exodus is Hebrew, and the consensus of scholarship says that the Hebrew sentence at Exodus 20:13, lo tizrak, is best translated as thou shalt do no murder. Then we get down to this other thing. God announces 613 commandments in all, including thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So I guess according to that part of Exodus, if there was a witch, you're supposed to kill the witch. He that blasphemeth the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. He that killeth any man shall surely be put to death. Those are both from Leviticus, and so forth. And then there's also the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Old Testament, where God says to Abraham, who's like his most devout follower, in that Old Testament book, he says, kill your son on the top of Mount Moriah and do it to me as an offering. I command you to do that. But ultimately, he withdraws the command by replacing Isaac with a ram. So that becomes the offering to God at the end. But it still seems like there's parts of the Bible anyway where God is not necessarily saying you shouldn't kill, but that actually you should. So you could argue that this is a bit inconsistent, and therefore it becomes a little bit more difficult to determine whether or not we're really biblically prohibited from killing in all cases. Another obvious problem, or at least fundamental issue with the biblical prohibition as the basis for pacifism is, well, let me ask you, what do you think is another basic issue with this? If you believe that this was the reason to be a pacifist, it would really only have appeal to what people? I mean, it would have appeal to some people, but you'd have to at least think that what, in order for you to take this as the primary reason to favor pacifism? Followers of God, right? So you'd have to believe in the religion. You have to be a follower of the Bible at least. And to other people, the obvious questions arise, like, is this really the word of God? Is this just a human document? You have to believe that God is real, and not only that he's real, but that this is the revealed word of God and that it's directly coming from him as a command. There's also the issue of whether this is a biblical requirement for all people, or if it's only for people that are in the religion. So is it like a religious requirement, like a dietary restriction on food that some people believe in various denominations of religion, or is it something that's supposed to hold on all humans in general? So that's the reason that some give for pacifism, the biblical reason. But I also tried to reveal to you some of the counterpoints to that. Now, here's another reason in favor of pacifism. So I'm going to go ahead and clear away this note because I think we probably covered that and taken it down. Another reason in favor of pacifism we'll label as reason B, and that could be the sacredness of life reason. Sacredness of life. So this is not necessarily a religious-based reason. You don't have to be a member of any religion really to agree with this. So you could argue that this is perhaps more secular justification. because we're all capable, I think, most of us anyway, of feeling a sense of reverence and respect at the beauty and the complexity of living things, big and small. When you're looking at nature and you're looking at animals surviving in the wild, or I don't know, even the amazing forests and trees and rainforests and oceans and the birds in the sky, many of us appreciate life and think that it's something good and that it's something even sacred that needs to be protected and preserved. Um, so these feelings about respect and appreciation for life lead some to say that life is sacred and therefore killing and destroying life is always wrong. Different types of pacifism can be derived from this view that life is sacred in a fundamental way. The most extreme would forbid killing any living thing. So don't just not kill people, but don't kill animals, don't kill insects. If you were a member of the Jainism sect of Hinduism, the Indian religion, they actually take this view very seriously. And so they're committed to ethical veganism. But furthermore, they think that when you're eating the plants and so on, you should only eat those that have fallen from the tree rather than those that are currently already still on the tree, so that you don't like discontinue its life cycle. But that's the most far-reaching and extreme version of pacifism that could be derived from this view. A more moderate view, of course, would permit the killing of animals and plants, but just not humans. Anyway, this basis for pacifism has some appeal because I think we're all disgusted for the most part by images of things being killed and having their lives destroyed. But there are also counterpoints to this. One might argue that if we value life and we think it's sacred, then wouldn't it make sense that sometimes we might actually need to use lethal violence, including killing, to preserve and to protect life? If life is sacred, then that might mean that you think we should preserve as much as possible and by any means. Because again, consider if killing is wrong, that means life is sacred, and that killing is taking away something sacred, and therefore the more lives that we save, the greater the good. If we saw, for example, that there was a person that was like shooting innocent people, and you had the ability to kill that person, like say a trained sniper could take the person out, then you probably would think, even if you believe in the sacredness of life, that that's a good thing to do, because even though you're killing one person and that's taking away a life, you're preventing that killer from killing an even greater number. And that's just on an individual level, but you could argue sometimes that war is similar. Like if there's a regime that's fighting to destroy a whole bunch of innocent people, and the only way they can be stopped from that is by some kind of military intervention that's going to result in death itself, but is ultimately going to discontinue the ongoing violence that the perpetrators are enacting, then you might think that even consistent with the belief that life is sacred, it doesn't completely rule out all forms of killing. And another issue with the justification provided here is that if life is sacred, one implication that might have is that you shouldn't even take risks with life, because you're playing with the possibility that you're going to destroy something that is sacred and fundamentally important. But when there's like a fallen martyr, somebody who dies for like a righteous cause, we don't usually say they did something bad and wrong because they allowed themselves to die for that cause. We usually think that there's at least some type of nobility and valor that can come from that. So these are another set of explanations for some reason to favor pacifism, as well as like a little bit of counterpoint. After that, a third justification is offered: the right to life. The right to life, another justification. Some may try to avoid the problems of the sacredness view by saying killing is wrong because it violates the right to life that people have. Remember that rights trump utility. So if rights are more important than promoting the most overall happiness, then you might say that regardless of what the consequences are, we shouldn't kill because it destroys a person's life, which they have every right to have. On this belief or on this justification, you couldn't kill for utilitarian reasons, as was mentioned in the previous case, where it's susceptible to the objection that if life is sacred, we should preserve it by all means necessary, including even perhaps ironically or counterintuitively through lethal violence. But again, there are critics of this view too. They can say that to have a right implies the permissibility of defending that right against unjust aggression. So these are reasons that the author Lackey gives in order to try and promote and defend the idea of pacifism to the average reader. But then he goes a little farther and he wants to try and discuss one of those specific kinds of pacifism that we mentioned earlier, anti-war pacifism. And he wants to promote that idea too and give some reasonable justification for it. So Not everyone who believes in personal self-defense believes that war can be justified. For example, anti-war pacifists reject the justifiability of war, even if they might concede that sometimes personal acts of violence could be permitted. They say self-defense is okay, but all participation in war is wrong. So why believe in anti-war pacifism? That's our next thing to talk about. So I'm going to clear these away. Just put some of those notes up here. So this little part of the discussion has to do with reasons in favor of anti-war pacifism more specifically. Okay. So the first reason that he gives is the killing of soldiers, which you might think isn't the most obvious place to take it, but he'll give an interesting, robust defense of this basis. So in all wars, soldiers, at least some number of them, are killed. And many people say that's acceptable morally if the war is just. And some people might say it's acceptable morally even if it's a not just war, because it's always honorable to fight for your country, perhaps, even if the country's doing things that can't be, in the big picture, justified morally. But the anti-war pacifist doesn't agree with that. They don't take the killing of even soldiers for granted, and they claim that when that happens, it's still intentionally violating the right to life the soldiers have. Now, there's an objection that one could give to this. An objection against this. So one reply or objection, I'm just going to put an objection, little OBJ right there, that stands for an objection to this. So maybe even make it more specific, objection to arrow pointing to that. Some will say that, well, what the problem is that isn't killing in war a matter of self-defense in many cases, which even the anti-war pacifist acknowledges to be at least occasionally justified. So objection. Usually killing in war is a matter of self-defense. So here we are looking at a reason to agree with or at least consider anti-war pacifism, and the reason stated is that it involves the killing of soldiers who have a right to life just as much as anyone else. Somebody, though, hears that and they might say, I don't agree, because when it's a soldier that's killing in war, the reason they're doing it is because they're trying to just act in self-defense. And if self-defense is okay, even to the anti-war pacifist, personal violence can be permitted. Then what's wrong with the soldiers doing it in war if all they're doing is just defending their own life? But he has a reply to this. And his reply is like, you really can't claim self-defense unless a few criteria are met. So here's the response that he gives against this. Okay, so the response to this is, let me just move a little bit to give myself more room to write this. So let me just make sure the notes are readable to you. We said a reason in favor of anti-war pacifism, this. But here's an objection to that. And it's because of limitations of board space and et cetera that I'm drawing the reply to this above and pointing an arrow at it. What's the response to this objection? So what's his counterpoint to the objection? His response is that you can only actually claim self-defense in a legitimate way if two factors, okay? So if number one, you have no other way to save your life except by killing. That says you have no other way to save your life except by killing. And second basis for legitimate claim of self-defense, you did nothing to provoke the attack that you're defending against. So you did nothing to provoke the attack. Sorry, write it correctly. I know it's a little small and a little bit less legible than I would like ideally. Next time we'll definitely have the proper chat working. It's just showing an error. I think probably because it thinks that I'm like, I don't know, I'm trying to incite terrorism. But anyway, the response to this objection is you really can't claim self-defense just any time you want. If it's a morally justified or legitimate case of claiming self-defense, these two things have to both be true, which he argues is not generally satisfied in the case of most wars. So first off, for you to say you're defending yourself and that's the reason you're killing people, it has to be true that there's no other way you could save your life except by killing. Okay, so like suppose that you had an intruder in your house and they stole some items and now they're outside the house and they're running away down the street and they're like 300 meters away. If you pull out like a rifle and you start shooting at them from 300 meters away, it's no longer that your life is in threat. So this is not really self-defense anymore. Your life and the preservation and sustaining of that life can be achieved without killing that person. So self-defense means it's basically kill or be killed. But it's not really a kill or be killed scenario if you have ways of saving your life except by killing. So the author points out that you can always, in a war scenario, you could always surrender, which I don't know if is the best basis that he gives, but he gives another, I think, reason that's a little bit more satisfying intellectually. He says most soldiers in modern warfare are not killed in kill or be killed scenarios, but rather they launch munitions from safe launching points, which are like in fortified bases, or in some cases are in totally remote locations because they're operating unmanned drones and munitions are being launched in that way. So if the soldier had a gun pointed at you and it's like you've got to kill them before they shoot you, or they've already started shooting at you, you might say, okay, that's a classic case of self-defense. But modern warfare often involves people that are fighting which are not in the immediate fire of the enemy. So, you know, if you're just launching bombs from a safe location, I mean, sometimes these drones are being operated in an entirely different country. You know, they could be using these remote weapons without ever having faced danger themselves. So in cases like that, it's not like you need to kill to avoid having your life ended. So it's not an exactly clear case of self-defense. And then related to point number 2, you couldn't claim self-defense if you're the one that provoked the attack against you in the first place. Let me give you an example. Suppose that I walk up to a random person on the street and I stab them in the left arm, and then they start coming at me with a gun. And then I say, okay, well, I'm gonna have to kill you because it's self-defense. You're threatening me with that gun. Can you kind of understand how that's not a very legitimate example of self-defensive action? Why not? Because in the example that I'm giving you, you are the instigator. You initiated the conflict. And even if that causes a person, it triggers them to like try to kill you in response or in retaliation. Now, when you claim self-defense, it's not an authentic claim or a legitimate claim of self-defense because none of this would have even been happening if you hadn't struck first. So the United States, our country, we're really not fighting a lot of defensive wars because we have so much military weaponry and such a powerful military overall that nations don't really want to test getting into a military conflict with us. So it's typically not the case that when we go into war, like whether it was Iraq or whatever, that we're necessarily innocent and just trying to defend ourselves. So if we like instigated a war and then we threaten people in the theater of war, when our soldiers say, well, they're attacking us, so we've got to kill them in self-defense, it's kind of a more complicated claim of self-defense than a straightforward case where you are not the aggressor and you're just repelling attacks against you. So like, when we invaded Iraq, just to use that as the example again, we dropped a lot of bombs, we sent soldiers out there, they've got high-powered weapons, mortars, and all the rest. And some of the population in Iraq that sees the US military might feel threatened because of these incursions into their land and et cetera. And then they might try and attack our forces. When they do, if the forces are like, well, we have to defend ourselves, then you could argue, in fact, that this is not necessarily a classic case of self-defense because we, in a way, provoke the attacks ourselves against our own military. And you say here, so it shows that if there are exceptions to morals, then it makes the logic basically contradicting itself. Well, sort of is one way to put it, I guess. It's basically that if you believe that the killing of soldiers is acceptable in war because it's only being done as self-defense, he's trying to just make that a little bit more problematic. Like, how can you really say it's self-defense if, for example, it's not even necessary for you to kill to remain alive because you're launching these weapons from positions that are not even under attack? And also, if you're the military instigator, then the retaliation coming back against you is something that you can't just claim as a genuine example of self-defense that you are trying to repel when you attack them. So, he's trying to just show that it's not as straightforward as you might have thought to claim that when soldiers kill, they're just defending themselves and they're using self-defense, which is also acceptable in the personal case. He's saying it's complicated by the fact that in modern war, munitions are launched from safe launching points, and also in a nation like the United States, which is of course where we live and where the author lives and what we're kind of talking about from that point of view, we're not necessarily like the innocent victims of external aggressors. We launch these wars, and then when people respond with force against us, we might say it's not exactly like we're just defending ourselves, but instead we're responding against attacks that we ourselves provoked. So like in the analogy that I was giving, if I stab a person, they're trying to kill me, and then I say I had to kill them as self-defense. Well, why are they trying to attack me? They wouldn't have done it unless I attacked them first. So yeah, another issue is this. Some people might say that don't these soldiers assume risk? So that's a second objection to the killing of soldiers basis. Let me then clear some more room and try to write that. We just have a couple minutes left. So we'll finish off the last leftover notes on Lackey when we come back on Tuesday. And then I'll give you the counter argument to him from a different author. That's Jan Narveson. So by that point, we'll sort of see both sides of the issue, like those that are more in favor of the pacifist point of view and those that are more preferable to the anti-pacifist point of view. Okay, so another objection to this. So the soldiers legitimately assume the risks associated with war. So again, let me just make sure that the picture is clear here. Lackey says there's reasons to be an anti-war pacifist, and the first one he's offering is that it involves the killing of soldiers. In reaction to that, one might say, well, isn't it a matter of self-defense? But he tried to give a counterpoint to that, as we just described. Another objection that he describes or explains in opposition to this is that it's not a moral tragedy when the soldiers that are killed in war are killed, because it's kind of like they know what they're getting into by enlisting. That's the basic point here. Like when they enlist and when they decide to serve in military, they know that they're assuming certain possible risks. Like, for example, if I'm going to go fight in the military, I might get killed, I might get captured. And so if I'm willing to join the military, I take on the risks that are associated with military service. So why should we think that there's some kind of moral problem with the killing of these soldiers? Because don't they already recognize and understand that this is a possibility when they decided to enlist? So this is just another way of trying to say it's not morally problematic for the soldiers that are killed in war to be killed. That would also sort of throw like a little bit of a point of critique to his claim. But he wants to respond to that too. So the way he responds to this second objection is by saying that actually this would only make sense if the military or the service members that we're talking about are not are volunteer military service members. They would have had to like choose to enlist for this to make sense, right? To assume the risks of war and for you then to be a legitimate target because you've taken those risks on willingly, you would have had to voluntarily enlist. But this would not apply at all to soldiers if they were drafted into the military or conscripted into the military without having any choice in the matter. And in fact, in most modern wars, the army is not all volunteer. And we might not have noticed that because in the United States, ever since the Vietnam War, we've gone away from the draft system. Even though you still have to enlist in selective service, I believe, when you turn 18. We haven't had a draft called where people were called without having volunteered to sign on for the military since then. But it actually takes a very wealthy nation to offer enough financial incentives and otherwise, like, oh, we're going to pay for your college or we're going to give you a certain kind of financial stipend. It takes a wealthier nation to be able to sustain an all-volunteer military like what we have. And in fact, many of the nations that we fight against are just there on the basis of drafted soldiers. So if you're fighting against soldiers that have been drafted in, then we could also say that that kind of eliminates the power of this objection, because those soldiers did not choose to assume any risks. They were coerced into their military service. So we're getting to the end of Lackey. We just have a couple of leftover points to finish with on him. So I would ask you guys, try to read the Jan Narveson article for Tuesday. I'll be sending back the exam scores on Sunday. And in between now and then, you know, I hope you guys have a really good weekend. I will start taking a better tally and taking photos of the attendance, just because I want to try and track it better and make sure that we don't, you know, have a trend of lesser attendance as the class runs on. I mean, I know there's some attrition over the course of a semester, and we all have busy lives, but this is an obligation that you take on by enlisting in the course. So thanks again, everybody. I appreciate all of your help and attendance as usual. Feel free to just sign off and say goodbye, and I'm going to let you head out to your next thing you're doing today. Okay, guys? Thank you so much. Take it easy, guys. Santino, Mary Jane, Jennifer, all the rest of you guys that are here. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon. All right? Thanks again. Bye-bye.